The man who laughed at her apron never noticed the empire she was building behind it. The evening rush had arrived early at Harbor Bean Cafe. The scent of roasted coffee, cinnamon pastries, and fresh caramel drifted through the crowded shop as customers filled nearly every table. Outside, a cold November rain painted the streets of downtown Hartford in reflections of gold and silver. Inside, Claire Morgan moved calmly between tables carrying trays of coffee and sandwiches, her navy apron tied neatly over a simple gray sweater. To most people, she looked exactly like what she appeared to be. A woman working a second job to make ends meet. A woman whose best years had fallen behind her. A woman trying to survive. Claire had heard every version of that story before. Some people said it with sympathy, others with judgment, a few with quiet satisfaction. She never corrected them. It saved time. She placed a latte on a corner table and smiled politely at a customer before checking the next order. The evening crowd continued growing. Students worked on laptops. Couples shared desserts. Business professionals loosened their ties after long days at the office. It was an ordinary Thursday night. At least, it felt ordinary until the front door opened. Claire noticed him before she intended to. Some faces remained familiar, no matter how many years pass. Ethan Brooks stepped into the cafe wearing a charcoal overcoat and an expensive watch that caught the warm overhead lighting. The rain had left droplets on his shoulders. Beside him walked a woman Claire did not recognize. Young, elegant, confident. They looked like people accustomed to being noticed. Ethan scanned the room casually before his eyes landed on Claire. For a brief second, surprise crossed his face. Then came recognition. Then amusement. Claire felt the familiar sensation of her stomach tightening, though it faded almost immediately. 3 years earlier, that moment would have ruined her entire week. Now it was simply another moment. Ethan guided his companion toward a table near the window. He never looked away from Claire as she approached to take their order. "Claire," he said with a smile that felt polished, rather than warm. "I did not expect to see you here." Claire returned a professional smile. "Good evening, Ethan." His companion looked between them. "You know each other?" "We used to be married," Ethan replied casually. The woman blinked in surprise. "Really? A long time ago," Claire said gently. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "So this is your second job?" Claire nodded. "It is." A faint laugh escaped him. Not cruel enough to attract attention. Just enough. "You always worked hard," he said. "I guess some things never change." Claire wrote down their order. "What can I get for you?" Ethan ordered an espresso. His companion requested tea. Claire thanked them and walked away before the conversation could continue. Behind her, she heard Ethan chuckle softly. She did not need to hear the words to understand the meaning. The sound itself carried enough history. As she prepared drinks behind the counter, memories surfaced briefly. The divorce. The arguments. The years spent supporting Ethan while he built his company. The promises that slowly transformed into excuses. The long process of rebuilding a life from pieces. Yet the memories no longer controlled her. They floated through her mind like distant weather. Important once. Not now. A few minutes later, Claire returned with their drinks. Ethan accepted his espresso and glanced at her apron again. "Still working harder than everyone else, I see." Claire smiled politely. "Have a good evening." His companion seemed uncomfortable now. She stirred her tea while avoiding eye contact. Ethan, however, appeared entertained by the situation. He looked around the cafe before speaking again. "You always talked about building something bigger." His smile widened slightly. "Life takes people in unexpected directions." Claire met his gaze. Calm. Unshaken. "It certainly does." For a moment, Ethan seemed disappointed by her lack of reaction. He had expected embarrassment. Perhaps even resentment. Instead, he found neither. That puzzled him more than anger ever could. The rest of the evening passed quickly. Customers came and went. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Ethan eventually left with his companion, disappearing into the city lights beyond the glass. He never looked back. Claire watched the door close behind him. Then she returned to work. 2 hours later, the cafe had nearly emptied. Chairs were being stacked. The espresso machines had fallen silent. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Claire untied her apron and hung it neatly in the staff room. Most people would have gone home afterward. Claire did not. She walked into the parking lot and entered a black sedan waiting beneath a street lamp. The driver greeted her with a respectful nod. "Good evening, Ms. Morgan." Claire smiled. "Good evening, David." He handed her a leather portfolio. "The documents arrived this afternoon." Claire opened the folder. Several pages rested inside. Numbers, signatures, transfer agreements. The final pieces of a transaction that had taken nearly 2 years to arrange. She reviewed them carefully beneath the soft interior lighting. Then she picked up a pen. Without hesitation, she signed the final page. David glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Congratulations." Claire looked out the window toward the city skyline, glowing in the distance. Her expression remained calm. Not yet. The black sedan moved quietly through the rain-soaked streets of Hartford while city lights reflected across the windows like scattered gold. Claire Morgan sat in the back seat, holding the leather portfolio on her lap. Most people would have seen nothing remarkable about the woman leaving a late-night cafe shift. Her sweater was simple. Her coat was practical. Her hands still carried the faint scent of coffee beans and vanilla syrup from hours behind the counter. Yet the documents resting inside that folder represented years of decisions invisible to everyone around her. She looked out at the skyline and remembered a different night 3 years earlier. A night when everything had fallen apart. The divorce had not happened because of a single argument or a dramatic betrayal. The truth was far less cinematic and far more painful. It happened slowly. One disappointment at a time. One broken promise at a time. One conversation where Ethan's ambitions became more important than their marriage. Claire remembered sitting alone at their kitchen table while Ethan worked late at the office. Then later, while he traveled. Then later still, while he chased expansion plans that always seemed to require one more sacrifice. She supported him through every stage. When cash flow became tight during the early years of his company, she took extra consulting projects. When investors demanded more growth, she adjusted her schedule to accommodate his endless meetings. When stress consumed him, she became the stable one, the patient one, the understanding one. For a long time, she believed that was what partnership meant. The realization that it was no longer mutual arrived quietly. Like winter, by the time the divorce papers were signed, Claire felt less heartbroken than exhausted. Everyone assumed Ethan had won. His company appeared successful. His name appeared in local business magazines. He attended charity galas and leadership conferences. Claire left with a modest settlement and an uncertain future. Friends offered sympathy. Some offered pity. Neither interested her very much. What interested her was freedom. 2 weeks after the divorce became official, Claire sat inside a small public library and opened a notebook. On the first page, she wrote a simple sentence. "Build something nobody can take away." That sentence became her compass. The sedan turned onto a quieter street lined with historic brick buildings. Claire opened the portfolio again. Numbers filled the pages. Ownership percentages. Investment structures. Acquisition agreements. Most people would find them boring. Claire found them beautiful. Every line represented patience, discipline, time. Her journey had never involved a lucky break. No mysterious inheritance appeared. No wealthy benefactor arrived to rescue her. Instead, she built her future the same way she approached everything else. One decision at a time. During the first year after the divorce, she accepted a teaching position at a local community education program. The pay was modest. To supplement her income, she picked up evening shifts at Harbor Bean Cafe. Friends questioned the decision. Some believed she was overworking herself. Others wondered why someone with her education was serving coffee. Claire simply smiled and continued showing up. What nobody understood was that every dollar had a purpose. Every hour had a destination. While others spent money to create the appearance of success, Claire quietly accumulated assets. She studied markets during lunch breaks. She reviewed annual reports before sunrise. She attended online investor meetings after midnight. The routine became almost invisible. That was exactly how she wanted it. Across town, Ethan's company was growing rapidly. Expansion looked impressive from the outside. New offices opened. New executives were hired. Press releases celebrated each milestone. Yet Claire noticed details most people ignored. Revenue increased. So did debt. Growth accelerated. So did risk. Every quarterly report told a more complicated story than the headline suggested. Claire never celebrated those observations. She simply paid attention. Over time, she began purchasing small positions through investment partnerships. Tiny percentages. Barely noticeable. The kind of acquisitions nobody considered threatening. Year after year, the positions grew. Quietly. Methodically. The city lights outside blurred as the sedan crossed a bridge overlooking the Connecticut River. David adjusted the rearview mirror. "You seem thoughtful tonight." Claire smiled faintly. "I was remembering." "The cafe?" Claire shook her head. "The beginning." David nodded. He had worked with her long enough to understand. Success interested Claire less than progress. She rarely looked backward. Tonight was different. Perhaps seeing Ethan again had reopened a chapter she believed was closed. Not emotionally. Practically. He still viewed her through the lens of the past. That realization fascinated her. Ethan considered himself observant, strategic, visionary. Yet he never once asked why Claire worked a second job. He simply assumed he already knew the answer. The sedan eventually stopped in front of a modern office building overlooking the river. The lobby lights glowed against the dark sky. Claire stepped out carrying the portfolio beneath her arm. She rode the elevator to the top floor and entered a private conference room where several professionals were waiting. Attorneys, financial advisors, analysts. They rose when she entered. One of them smiled. "Everything is ready." Claire took her seat at the head of the table. Through the glass walls, Hartford stretched beneath the night sky. Calm, silent, unaware. She opened the portfolio one final time. The transaction was almost complete now. Years of preparation were converging toward a single outcome. Across the city, Ethan Brooks was probably sleeping peacefully, convinced he understood exactly who Claire Morgan had become, and that certainty was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. The conference room overlooked the Connecticut River like the bridge of a ship preparing to enter unfamiliar waters. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the city lights while a dozen documents rested neatly across the polished table. Claire Morgan sat quietly at the head of the room, listening as attorneys discussed timelines, approvals, and regulatory procedures. Most people would have found the conversation exhausting. Claire listened with complete focus. Every number mattered. Every detail mattered. Because unlike luck, details could be controlled. One of the financial analysts clicked through a presentation displayed on a large screen. Charts appeared. Ownership structures, voting rights, acquisition pathways. The process had taken nearly 26 months to construct. 26 months of patience. 26 months of saying nothing while everyone around her assumed they understood her situation. "The final transfer is expected to close within 6 weeks, the analyst explained. "Assuming market conditions remain stable." Claire nodded. 6 weeks. Such a small period compared to everything that came before it. After the meeting ended, the professionals gathered their materials and gradually left the room. Soon Claire found herself alone with the city skyline, glowing beyond the glass. Snow had begun falling lightly over Hartford. Tiny white flakes drifted through the darkness like scattered pieces of paper. She stood beside the window and watched them in silence. Success always looked dramatic. From a distance, people loved stories about sudden wealth, overnight breakthroughs, instant transformations. The reality was usually much less exciting. Success was often repetitive, boring, built from thousands of small decisions nobody ever noticed. Claire knew this better than anyone. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Harbor Bean Cafe appeared on the screen. One of the evening managers needed help covering a Saturday shift. Claire smiled faintly and accepted without hesitation. To an outsider, the decision would seem strange. Why continue working there? Why spend hours carrying coffee and cleaning tables when she no longer needed the income? The answer was simple. The cafe had never been about money. It represented discipline. It reminded her where she started. It reminded her that dignity existed in every honest job. The next Saturday arrived beneath gray skies and freezing temperatures. The cafe filled quickly as customers escaped the cold. Claire moved comfortably through the familiar routine. Fresh coffee, warm pastries, friendly conversations. She enjoyed the work more than most people realized. There was something refreshing about serving people who had no expectations beyond a good cup of coffee. No board meetings, no negotiations, no headlines, just ordinary life. Around noon, 2 businessmen occupied a table near the window. Claire recognized them immediately. They worked for Brooks Technologies, Ethan's company. She had seen their photographs in annual reports and leadership announcements. Neither man recognized her. Why would they? To them, she was simply another cafe employee. She delivered their drinks and stepped away. As she cleaned a nearby table, fragments of their conversation drifted across the room. "The debt load keeps growing," one man said quietly. Ethan thinks another expansion will solve it. The other shook his head. The board is nervous. Claire continued wiping the table without reacting. Her expression remained neutral, yet she listened carefully, not because she needed confirmation. She already understood the numbers. Still, hearing executive's voice concerns added another layer to the picture. The conversation continued for several minutes before shifting toward unrelated topics. Eventually they left. Claire finished her shift and stepped outside into the cold afternoon air. Across the street, families carried shopping bags beneath holiday decorations hanging from lamp posts. Christmas lights had begun appearing throughout the city. The season of appearances was arriving once again. People decorating homes. Businesses decorating storefronts. Everyone trying to create beautiful images. Claire understood the temptation. Appearances were comfortable. Reality required patience. That evening she returned to her apartment, overlooking a quiet section of the river. The space was elegant but understated. Bookshelves lined one wall. Framed artwork decorated another. Nothing screamed wealth. Nothing needed to. Claire prepared a simple dinner and settled into a chair beside the window with a stack of financial reports. Several hours passed unnoticed. She highlighted sections, reviewed forecasts, compared market trends. Outside, snow continued falling. The river reflected thousands of lights from the city beyond. Around 10 o'clock, an email arrived. Claire opened it immediately. The sender was one of the investment firms involved in the transaction. The subject line contained only 3 words. Board meeting scheduled. Claire read the message twice. Then a third time. The date had been confirmed. The meeting would take place in less than a month. She set her laptop aside and stared out the window. Somewhere across town, Ethan was probably planning his next expansion strategy, preparing future announcements, looking ahead toward opportunities he believed belonged to him. The irony almost made her smile. He spent years building a company while assuming he controlled its future. He never considered that someone else might be building a future around it. Claire rose from her chair and walked toward the window. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the darkness. Calm, quiet, certain, much like the plan she had spent years creating. And for the first time since signing the final documents, she allowed herself to imagine the moment when Ethan Brooks would finally discover who had been purchasing pieces of his company all along. December arrived with sharp winds and early sunsets. Hartford seemed wrapped in a permanent glow of holiday lights and cold blue skies. Storefront windows displayed wreaths and garlands. Snow lined the sidewalks in uneven white banks. The city looked festive from the outside. Inside Brooks Technologies, however, the atmosphere felt very different. Ethan Brooks stood in the executive conference room studying a financial report spread across the polished table. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Hartford, but he barely noticed the view. For the third consecutive quarter, the numbers refused to cooperate with his optimism. Revenue remained strong. Growth remained visible, yet expenses continued climbing faster than expected. New acquisitions required additional financing. Expansion demanded more resources. The company looked successful to the public. Internally, the picture had become more complicated. Ethan loosened his tie and stared at a chart projected onto the wall. Several members of the leadership team sat quietly around the table. Nobody seemed eager to speak first. Finally, the chief financial officer cleared his throat. The board is becoming concerned. Ethan nodded once. I know. The debt ratios are attracting attention. Ethan remained calm. Growth always attracts criticism. The response sounded confident, but even he could hear the strain underneath it. The meeting continued for another hour. Questions, forecasts, projections, risk assessments. By the time it ended, Ethan felt exhausted. He gathered his notes and returned to his office overlooking the city. The room reflected everything he had spent years building. Awards lined the shelves. Framed magazine covers decorated one wall. Photographs from conferences and business events filled another. Every item represented a milestone. Every item reminded him how far he had come. Yet recently those reminders brought less satisfaction than they once did. His phone vibrated. A text message from his current girlfriend appeared on the screen. Dinner tonight? Ethan stared at the message for several seconds before replying. He claimed he was busy. The truth was more complicated. Lately, even moments of success felt strangely hollow. He walked toward the window and looked out across the city. Snow drifted slowly between office towers. Cars moved through the streets below like streams of light. For reasons he could not fully explain, his thoughts returned to Harbor Bean Cafe. More specifically, they returned to Claire. The image surprised him. Why was he thinking about her now? He had not thought seriously about his ex-wife in years. Yet ever since seeing her at the cafe, something felt unsettled. Perhaps it was her reaction, or lack of one. Ethan had expected embarrassment, maybe frustration. Instead, Claire appeared completely at peace. That detail bothered him more than he wanted to admit. 3 years earlier, he assumed the divorce would affect her far more than it affected him. She had been the emotional one, the supportive one, the stable presence in the background while he pursued larger ambitions. Seeing her now, he realized how much he had underestimated her resilience. Across town, Claire sat inside a quiet investment office reviewing reports with her legal team. Unlike Ethan's office, there were no awards displayed on the walls. No magazine covers. No public recognition. Claire never cared much about visibility. Results interested her more. A large digital display illuminated the conference room with financial data and ownership structures. One of the attorneys pointed toward a highlighted section. The final board review has been moved forward. Claire looked up. Forward. 2 weeks. The attorney smiled. The process is accelerating. Claire absorbed the information calmly. 2 weeks. Less time than expected. Around the table, several advisors exchanged optimistic glances. Years of work were approaching completion. Yet Claire felt no excitement. Only focus. She understood something many investors never learned. The closer a deal came to closing, the more discipline mattered. Celebration could wait. Precision could not. Later that evening, she arrived at Harbor Bean Cafe for another shift. The familiar smell of coffee welcomed her as she tied on her apron. Customers filled the tables while holiday music played softly overhead. Nothing about the scene suggested that the woman preparing cappuccinos was involved in a multi-million-dollar acquisition. Claire preferred it that way. Midway through the evening, a local business magazine caught her attention. Someone had left it on a table near the window. Ethan's photograph appeared on the cover. Hartford Visionary of the Year. Claire studied the image for a moment. Ethan looked exactly as he always had. Confident. Polished. Certain. She felt no resentment. No bitterness. Only curiosity. Success often creates dangerous illusions. People begin believing their own headlines. They mistake visibility for security, recognition for permanence. Claire closed the magazine and returned it to the table. Across the room, snow fell gently beyond the windows. The city continued celebrating the holiday season, unaware of the quiet transaction unfolding behind closed doors. Ethan still believed he was preparing for another chapter of growth. The board believed it was preparing for a difficult financial discussion. Investors believed they understood who controlled the future of Brooks Technologies. None of them knew the truth. None of them realized that every path was leading toward the same room, the same meeting, and the same moment when years of assumptions would finally collide with reality. The final week before Christmas arrived wrapped in snow and anticipation. Hartford glittered beneath thousands of holiday lights while businesses prepared for year-end celebrations and families hurried through crowded streets carrying gifts and shopping bags. To most people, the season felt joyful. To Ethan Brooks, it felt increasingly uncertain. He sat alone in his office long after sunset, studying a stack of reports spread across his desk. The numbers refused to cooperate. Revenue projections had softened. Financing costs continued rising. Several investors were asking difficult questions. None of the problems appeared catastrophic on their own. Together, however, they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Ethan rubbed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. Beyond the windows, snow drifted across the city skyline. Somewhere below, holiday music floated from a nearby plaza. The contrast felt strange. The city seemed relaxed while his company felt trapped in a race against time. His phone buzzed. Another message from the board chairman. Reminder about next week's special meeting. Ethan stared at the message for several seconds. The special meeting had become the subject of endless speculation inside the company. Officially, it concerned long-term strategy. Unofficially, everyone knew something significant was happening. What nobody knew was exactly what. Across town, Claire Morgan walked out of Harbor Bean Cafe carrying a small paper cup of hot coffee. Snowflakes landed softly on her dark coat as she crossed the parking lot. The familiar evening shift had ended. Customers had gone home. Chairs were stacked. The scent of coffee still lingered in the cold air. Claire paused beneath a street lamp and looked up at the falling snow. The world felt unusually quiet, perhaps because the years of preparation were finally approaching their conclusion. A black sedan waited nearby. David stepped out and opened the rear door. "Everything is confirmed," he said. Claire nodded and climbed inside. During the drive, neither spoke much. There was little left to discuss. The legal reviews were complete. Regulatory approvals had been secured. Funding arrangements were finalized. What remained was execution, the simplest part of the process on paper, often the most difficult part in reality. The following morning, Claire attended a private meeting with several advisors. A large conference table overlooked the Connecticut River, now partially edged with ice. Documents filled the room. Attorneys reviewed schedules. Financial analysts discussed contingencies. One by one, every remaining detail received attention. Finally, the lead attorney closed his folder and smiled. "By this time next week, everything changes." Several people around the table nodded. Claire remained quiet. Her reaction surprised some of them. Most clients celebrated at moments like this. Claire never did. She understood something many investors eventually learn. The transaction itself was not the achievement. The discipline required to reach it was. Later that afternoon, she stopped by a local bookstore before heading home. The small shop smelled of paper, cedar, and fresh coffee. Holiday decorations hung from the ceiling. Families wandered through aisles searching for gifts. Claire enjoyed places like this. Ordinary places. Places where nobody cared about board meetings or acquisitions. While browsing a display near the front entrance, she noticed a business magazine featuring Ethan on the cover again. Another article. Another interview. Another celebration of his leadership. Claire skimmed the headline briefly before returning the magazine to the shelf. The image no longer stirred any emotion. Not anger. Not regret. Not even satisfaction. The years had transformed Ethan from a central character in her life into a distant figure moving through a separate story. What mattered now was not the past. It was the future. Meanwhile, inside Brooks Technologies, rumors continued spreading. Executives whispered in hallways. Department heads exchanged concerned looks. The board meetings seemed to dominate every conversation. Even Ethan felt the tension. During a lunch meeting with senior leadership, he attempted to project confidence. He discussed upcoming initiatives and long-term opportunities. The words sounded convincing. Yet beneath the surface, uncertainty remained. For the first time in years, Ethan felt as though events were moving beyond his control. That evening, he left the office later than usual and walked through the snowy parking lot toward his car. As he unlocked the door, his phone rang. The caller identification displayed the name of the board chairman. Ethan answered immediately. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, he remained standing beside his vehicle staring into the darkness. The special meeting had been moved forward again. 48 hours. That was all. 48 hours until the most important board session in company history. Across the city, Claire stood beside her apartment window watching snow settle along the riverbank below. The city lights reflected across the water in shimmering ribbons of gold and silver. Her phone rested on a nearby table. Beside it sat a folder containing the final authorization documents. Everything was ready. Everything was in place. Claire wrapped her hands around a warm mug and looked out across the winter skyline. Somewhere beyond the falling snow, Ethan Brooks was preparing for a meeting he believed would determine the future of his company. What he did not realize was that the future had already been decided. He simply had not met the person holding it yet. The morning of the board meeting arrived beneath a pale winter sky. Hartford looked quiet beneath a blanket of fresh snow, but inside Brooks Technologies, tension filled every hallway. Employees moved through the building with unusual restraint. Conversations became shorter. Smiles appeared less often. Everyone sensed that something important was about to happen. Nobody knew exactly what. Ethan Brooks arrived earlier than usual. His black sedan pulled into the executive parking area just after 7 o'clock. The company headquarters rose above the snowy streets like a monument to everything he had spent years building. As he stepped from the vehicle, cold air swept across the parking lot. He adjusted his coat and looked toward the glass tower. Normally the sight filled him with pride. Today it filled him with questions. Inside the lobby, several employees greeted him. Ethan responded politely, though his attention remained elsewhere. The board meeting dominated every thought. The chairman had offered few details. The financial officers seemed unusually guarded. Even trusted executives appeared to know more than they were willing to say. By the time Ethan reached the top floor, his uneasiness had grown stronger. Across the city, Claire Morgan stood before the window of her apartment overlooking the Connecticut River. Snow drifted gently across the water while sunlight reflected off the ice lining the shoreline. The morning felt peaceful, almost ordinary. Claire wore a tailored navy suit and a cream-colored coat resting across a nearby chair. On the dining table sat a leather portfolio containing documents that represented years of patience. She poured herself a cup of coffee and watched the river in silence. 3 years earlier, she had stood in a very different apartment wondering how she would rebuild her life. Back then, the future felt uncertain. Every step required effort. Every dollar required discipline. She remembered leaving job interviews, taking evening shifts, reading financial reports after midnight while the rest of the city slept. Nobody applauded those years. Nobody noticed them. Yet those invisible years had become the foundation of everything happening now. Her phone vibrated. A message from David appeared. The board members are arriving. Claire smiled faintly. She replied with 2 words. On my way. At company headquarters, board members gradually filled the executive conference room. The long, polished table overlooked downtown Hartford through massive windows stretching from floor to ceiling. Snow-covered rooftops and church steeples created a postcard view of the city. Normally, the room hosted strategic discussions and quarterly reviews. Today, it felt different. Anticipation lingered in the air. Ethan greeted directors as they entered. Some seemed friendly. Others appeared distracted. Several avoided discussing the purpose of the meeting altogether. That detail bothered him more than anything else. The chairman eventually arrived carrying a thin folder. He offered Ethan a polite smile before taking his seat. We will begin shortly. Ethan nodded. Can you tell me what this is about? The chairman folded his hands. You will understand soon enough. The answer provided no comfort. 20 minutes later, everyone was seated. The meeting officially began. Financial updates appeared first. Revenue, debt exposure, future obligations. Ethan listened carefully. None of the information surprised him. He already knew the company faced challenges. Yet the board members seemed less interested in discussing those challenges than in moving toward something else. Eventually, the chairman closed his report. The room became quiet. There is one final matter, he said. Several board members exchanged glances. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. The chairman continued. Over the past 2 years, a significant ownership position has been assembled through a series of investment partnerships and acquisitions. Ethan frowned. He already knew about the investor. Everyone did. Rumors had circulated for months. The mysterious buyer had become one of the most discussed subjects inside the company. Yet nobody knew the identity behind the purchases. This investor now holds a controlling interest, the chairman continued. The room remained silent. Ethan leaned forward. Who is it? The chairman looked toward the conference room doors. She is here. Ethan blinked. She. Before he could process the word, the doors opened. Every head in the room turned. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence. A woman entered carrying a leather portfolio. Her navy suit was elegant but understated. Her expression remained calm, confident, familiar. For a brief moment, Ethan did not understand what he was seeing. Then recognition arrived. Claire Morgan walked into the room. Several board members immediately stood to greet her. The chairman smiled warmly. Good morning. Claire returned the greeting with a polite nod. Ethan remained frozen in his chair. The woman he had seen serving coffee. The woman he assumed was struggling. The woman he believed he understood. She moved calmly toward the head of the table as though she belonged there. And judging by the reaction of everyone else in the room, she absolutely did. Outside the windows, snow continued falling across Hartford. Inside the conference room, years of assumptions began collapsing in complete silence. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence inside the conference room felt almost unreal. Snow drifted beyond the towering glass windows while Hartford continued its ordinary morning, completely unaware that an extraordinary moment was unfolding 30 stories above the city. Claire Morgan walked calmly toward the head of the table carrying the same leather portfolio she had held countless times before. There was nothing dramatic about her movement. No triumph. No performance. Yet every step seemed to deepen the silence around her. Ethan Brooks remained seated, staring at her as though reality had suddenly changed shape. His mind searched desperately for an explanation. Perhaps there had been a mistake. Perhaps she was representing someone else. Perhaps she was there as a consultant. Anything seemed more believable than the truth beginning to reveal itself. Claire greeted several board members by name. They responded warmly, respectfully, naturally. The familiarity struck Ethan harder than anything else. These people knew her. Not casually, not professionally. They knew her well. The chairman motioned toward the seat beside him. "Thank you for joining us." Claire smiled politely. "Thank you for having me." Ethan finally found his voice. "What is going on?" The question sounded sharper than he intended. Nobody answered immediately. Instead, the chairman opened a folder resting in front of him. As we discussed earlier, a controlling ownership position has been assembled through a series of acquisitions and investment partnerships over the last 2 years. Ethan looked from the chairman to Claire and back again. Understanding arrived slowly. Then all at once. "No," the word escaped before he could stop it. Claire met his eyes calmly. There was no satisfaction in her expression. No revenge. Only quiet certainty. The chairman continued. "The controlling interest is now held by Morgan Capital Holdings." Ethan frowned. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. Then another realization followed. Morgan. Claire's last name. His pulse quickened. "Morgan Capital?" he asked quietly. Claire folded her hands on the table. "Yes." Ethan stared at her. "You own Morgan Capital?" Claire nodded once. Around the room, board members remained silent. They had witnessed major negotiations, mergers, and acquisitions throughout their careers. Few had ever seen a moment quite like this. Ethan leaned back in his chair. The room suddenly felt smaller. Every memory from the past several years began rearranging itself. The second job, the coffee shop, the quiet apartment, the simple clothes, the lack of visible luxury. He had mistaken all of it for struggle. He never considered another possibility. Claire opened her portfolio and removed several documents. "The acquisition process began 26 months ago," she explained. Her voice remained calm and professional. "The initial purchases were intentionally small. Over time, additional positions were acquired through independent investment structures." Ethan listened in stunned silence. Claire continued. "Every acquisition complied with applicable regulations and disclosure requirements." One of the board members smiled faintly. "It was one of the most disciplined acquisition strategies I have seen." Ethan barely heard him. His attention remained fixed on Claire. "You were buying my company?" Claire looked at him carefully. "I was investing in a company I believed had value." The distinction mattered. Ethan understood that immediately. She was not describing revenge. She was describing opportunity. Somehow that made the moment even more powerful. The chairman slid a document across the table. "As of this morning, all transfers have officially closed." Ethan looked down at the paperwork. The numbers seemed impossible. Yet there they were. Verified. Signed. Finalized. Years of ownership had changed hands. Years of assumptions had collapsed. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the city skyline. Inside, nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Ethan looked back toward Claire. "The cafe." Claire smiled faintly. "What about it? Why were you working there?" Several board members exchanged curious glances. It was the same question Ethan had been asking himself since she entered the room. Claire thought for a moment before answering. "Because I liked it." The response seemed almost absurd. Yet she continued. "It reminded me that work has value regardless of who notices it." The room remained quiet. "And because I never wanted appearances to become more important than reality." Ethan lowered his gaze. The words landed harder than any accusation could have. For years he had measured success through visibility, recognition, headlines, growth announcements. Claire had measured success differently, through discipline, patience, results. The difference was suddenly impossible to ignore. One board member cleared his throat. "There is also the matter of leadership moving forward." The statement shifted the atmosphere immediately. Ethan looked up. The chairman nodded. "That discussion begins today." Claire remained composed. She had spent years preparing for this moment. Yet even now, she appeared less interested in power than responsibility. That realization unsettled Ethan more than anything else. Because for the first time, he understood exactly how badly he had misjudged her. The woman he laughed at in a coffee shop had never been struggling to survive. She had been quietly building the future while he was busy admiring the present. And now, sitting across from him at the head of the boardroom table, she held the future of Brooks Technologies in her hands. The boardroom remained silent long after the reality became impossible to deny. Snow drifted against the massive windows while the city below continued its normal routine, unaware that one of Hartford's most recognized companies had just entered a new era. Ethan Brooks sat motionless, his attention fixed on the documents spread across the polished table. Every page confirmed the same truth. Every signature led to the same conclusion. Claire Morgan controlled the company. The woman he had watched carrying coffee trays only weeks earlier now held a controlling interest in the business he spent years building. One of the board members finally broke the silence. "We should discuss the transition plan." The chairman nodded. Agreed. Several executives straightened in their chairs. Laptops opened. Notes appeared. The meeting moved forward. Yet for Ethan, time seemed strangely disconnected. He heard voices. He heard discussions. He understood the words. But his thoughts remained trapped somewhere between memory and realization. Across the table, Claire listened carefully as board members reviewed operational priorities and financial concerns. Her posture remained calm, professional, focused. She asked questions when necessary. She listened more than she spoke. The behavior caught Ethan off guard. He expected celebration. He expected triumph. Instead, Claire seemed interested only in the company itself. The distinction mattered. One director pointed toward a financial projection displayed on the screen. "The debt structure remains our largest challenge." Claire studied the chart. How quickly can refinancing options be explored? The question was practical, direct. The room immediately shifted into discussion. Ethan watched quietly. For years, he believed leadership meant commanding attention. Claire approached leadership differently. She approached it through listening, through preparation, through patience. The realization became increasingly uncomfortable. After nearly 2 hours, the formal portion of the meeting concluded. Board members gradually gathered their materials. Conversations began forming around the room. Several directors approached Claire personally. They congratulated her, discussed future plans, requested follow-up meetings. Their respect seemed genuine, not because she acquired control, because she had earned it. Eventually, the conference room began to empty. One by one, people departed until only a handful remained. Ethan stayed seated. He was not entirely sure why. Perhaps he needed answers. Perhaps he needed time. Claire remained near the window reviewing documents with the chairman. When their conversation ended, the chairman excused himself and left the room. For the first time that morning, Ethan and Claire found themselves alone. Snow continued falling outside. The city skyline appeared muted beneath gray winter clouds. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Ethan looked up. "How long?" Claire closed the folder in front of her. "How long what? How long have you been planning this?" Claire considered the question carefully. "The acquisition started 26 months ago." Ethan shook his head slowly. "No," his voice softened. "How long have you been planning your life after the divorce?" The question lingered between them. Claire walked toward the window and looked out across the city. The day after it happened, Ethan lowered his gaze. Somehow that answer hurt more than he expected. Not because she moved on, because she moved forward. There was a difference. For years he assumed Claire's story remained connected to his. He now realized she had been writing a completely different story all along. "I saw you in that cafe," Ethan said quietly. "I thought," his words faded. Claire turned toward him. "You thought I was struggling." Ethan laughed softly. The sound carried no humor. "Was I wrong?" Claire smiled faintly. "There were difficult years." She looked around the conference room. But difficult does not mean defeated. Ethan absorbed the statement in silence. He remembered the confidence he felt that evening at Harbor Bean Cafe, the casual amusement, the assumptions. Looking back now, the memory felt almost surreal. Claire had stood there serving coffee while quietly controlling more influence over his future than he could have imagined. Yet even then, she never corrected him. She never tried to impress him. She never revealed anything. "Why?" Ethan finally asked. "Why not tell me?" Claire's expression softened. "Because I did not need you to know." The answer landed gently, yet it carried enormous weight. For years, Ethan measured success through recognition, visibility, validation. Claire measured success differently. She built a future without needing anyone's approval, including his. The silence returned. This time it felt different, less tense, more honest. Ethan stood and walked slowly toward the window. Hartford stretched beneath them. Snow-covered rooftops, church steeples, bridges crossing the river. The city looked unchanged, yet everything felt different. "Congratulations," he said quietly. Claire looked surprised. Ethan nodded once. "You earned this." For the first time all morning, she smiled genuinely. Not because she won, because the statement was true. Years of discipline, years of sacrifice, years of invisible work. Nobody had handed her anything. Ethan understood that now. He also understood something else. The second job he laughed at had never been evidence of failure. It had been evidence of character. And as snow continued falling across the city, Ethan Brooks finally began to see Claire Morgan clearly for the first time in his life. The days following the board meeting passed like the slow movement of winter clouds across the Connecticut sky. News traveled quickly through financial circles, though few people knew the full story. Industry publications reported changes in ownership. Analysts discussed strategy shifts. Investors speculated about the future direction of Brooks Technologies. Yet the most important details remained private, known only to those who sat inside that conference room and witnessed the moment everything changed. Claire Morgan spent her first week as controlling owner doing exactly what she had always done. She worked. Every morning began before sunrise. Reports filled her desk. Meetings filled her calendar. Financial reviews stretched late into the evening. The difference was not the workload. The difference was the responsibility. For years she had observed the company from a distance. Now she carried direct responsibility for its future. The challenge energized her. It also humbled her. One snowy morning, Claire arrived at headquarters shortly after 7 o'clock. The city remained quiet beneath a pale winter sky. Inside the executive offices, lights glowed softly against polished glass and steel. Employees greeted her politely as she crossed the lobby. Some still seemed surprised to see her there. Rumors about her past continued circulating throughout the company. Stories about the coffee shop. Stories about the acquisition. Stories about the years nobody noticed what she was building. Claire ignored all of them. She had never been interested in becoming a story. She preferred becoming a result. Upstairs, a leadership meeting was already underway. Department heads gathered around a conference table reviewing operational challenges and upcoming goals. Claire listened carefully as each executive spoke. Some expected dramatic changes. Others feared restructuring. Instead, she focused on fundamentals: efficiency, sustainability, long-term stability. During the discussion, one executive asked a question that captured the uncertainty many people felt. "What is your vision for the company?" The room grew quiet. Claire considered the question before answering. "I want us to stop chasing appearances and start strengthening foundations." Several people nodded immediately. The statement felt simple, yet everyone understood its significance. For years, growth had been prioritized above nearly everything else. Now the focus was shifting toward durability. Across town, Ethan Brooks sat inside a small coffee shop near the river. Not Harbor Bean Cafe. He had not returned there since the board meeting. The embarrassment was not the reason. The memories were. Every time he thought about that evening, he found himself replaying details he once ignored. Claire taking orders. Claire carrying coffee. Claire smiling politely while he assumed he understood her situation. The memory felt different now. Sharper somehow. More revealing. A newspaper rested on the table beside him. An article discussed the recent ownership transition. Claire's name appeared several times throughout the piece. Ethan studied the page quietly. Surprisingly, he felt no anger. The shock had faded. What remained was reflection. For years he believed success made him observant. Recent events suggested otherwise. He had spent 3 years focused on expansion, recognition, and growth while completely overlooking one of the most disciplined people he had ever known. The realization remained difficult to accept. Later that afternoon, Claire reviewed a series of refinancing proposals with her financial team. Numbers filled multiple screens. Debt structures, interest rates, long-term projections. The work required concentration, patience, and attention to detail. Fortunately, those qualities had become second nature to her. By evening, several major decisions had been finalized. The company's future looked stronger already, not because of dramatic changes, because of careful ones. As employees prepared to leave for the day, Claire remained in her office overlooking Hartford. Snow-covered rooftops across the city. Traffic moved slowly beneath streetlights beginning to glow against the early winter darkness. She remembered standing in another office years earlier, watching Ethan celebrate expansion plans and ambitious goals. Back then she admired his confidence. Now she understood its limitations. Confidence without discipline eventually becomes vulnerability. Discipline without recognition often becomes strength. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from David appeared. The refinancing approval came through. Claire smiled. Another step completed. Another foundation strengthened. Outside the window, snowflakes drifted through the evening sky. The city seemed peaceful, stable, certain, much like Claire herself. She no longer measured success through headlines or ownership percentages. Those things mattered, but they were not the reason she kept going. The real victory happened long before the acquisition. It happened during the years nobody noticed. The years she showed up every day, worked every shift, studied every report, saved every dollar, learned every lesson. The company now belonged to her. Yet as Claire looked out across Hartford, she understood something important. The acquisition was never the destination. It was simply evidence of the woman she had become while building it. January arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. The holiday decorations gradually disappeared from storefront windows, and Hartford settled back into its ordinary rhythm. Yet inside Brooks Technologies, the atmosphere felt noticeably different. The uncertainty that once lingered through hallways and conference rooms had begun to fade. Employees no longer whispered about ownership changes. Instead, they focused on results. The company's finances were improving. Debt levels were stabilizing. Confidence was slowly returning. Claire Morgan spent most mornings moving between meetings, reviewing reports, and speaking directly with department leaders. Unlike many executives, she preferred walking through the building rather than remaining isolated in a corner office. Employees noticed the difference. She listened more than she spoke, asked questions instead of making assumptions, paid attention to details others overlooked. The habits that helped her build an empire quietly were now helping her rebuild a company publicly. One Wednesday afternoon, Claire stood inside a conference room reviewing a quarterly performance update. Snow-covered rooftops stretched beyond the windows while sunlight reflected across downtown Hartford. Around the table sat senior executives discussing operational improvements. Several metrics already showed positive movement. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worthy of headlines. Exactly the kind of progress Claire trusted most. Sustainable progress. After the meeting ended, she remained behind, organizing notes. A soft knock interrupted her concentration. She looked up. Ethan Brooks stood in the doorway. For a moment, neither spoke. Their interactions since the acquisition had remained professional and limited. Both seemed to understand that rebuilding respect required time. "Do you have a minute?" Ethan asked. Claire nodded. "Of course." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Something about his demeanor seemed different. Less defensive, less certain, not weaker, simply more honest. Ethan took a seat across from her at the conference table. The same table where their worlds had collided only weeks earlier. He looked out the window briefly before speaking. "I have been thinking a lot lately." Claire smiled faintly. "That sounds serious." Ethan laughed softly. "It probably is." The silence that followed felt comfortable rather than awkward. Eventually, he folded his hands together. "Do you know what bothers me most?" Claire waited. "It is not losing control of the company." The answer surprised her. Ethan looked down at the polished table. "It is realizing how little I understood what success actually was." Claire remained quiet. Ethan continued. "For years I thought success meant growth. Recognition. Bigger offices. More attention." He shook his head. "Meanwhile, you were building something real, and I never even noticed." Claire studied him carefully. The words carried no self-pity. No attempt to rewrite history. Only reflection. "You built something real too," she said. Ethan smiled. "Maybe. But I almost lost it because I became obsessed with how it looked instead of how strong it was." The admission lingered between them. Claire understood exactly what he meant. She had seen countless business leaders make the same mistake. Visibility often creates the illusion of stability. The two are not the same. Ethan looked toward her. "I owe you an apology." Claire raised an eyebrow slightly. "For what?" Ethan laughed quietly. "Where do I start?" She smiled. For the first time in years, the conversation felt almost natural. Ethan's expression grew more serious. "The coffee shop." Claire immediately understood. You do not need to apologize for that. I do. He shook his head. Not because of what happened afterward. Because of what I assumed before I knew anything. Claire listened carefully. Ethan continued. I saw your second job and decided I understood your life. His voice softened. I never stopped to ask questions. The honesty impressed her. Not because he admitted being wrong. Because he finally understood why. Claire looked out the window where sunlight reflected off fresh snow covering the city below. Most people judge what they can see. Ethan nodded. You never did. The statement made her smile. The truth was more complicated. She had judged people before. Everyone did. The difference was that experience taught her the danger of assumptions. Outside, traffic moved steadily through downtown Hartford. Inside the conference room, two people who once shared a marriage sat discussing lessons neither expected to learn. Ethan eventually stood and adjusted his coat. For what it is worth, he said, the company is in better hands than mine. Claire laughed softly. That is not a very objective opinion. Maybe not. He smiled. But it is accurate. Before leaving, Ethan paused near the door. One more thing. Claire looked up. What is it? He shook his head with quiet amazement. You really liked working at that cafe? Claire laughed. A genuine laugh this time. I did. Ethan smiled and opened the door. I think that is still the part one understand the least. When February arrived with brighter mornings and longer afternoons. Winter still held Hartford in its grip, but subtle signs of change appeared everywhere. Snow melted from sidewalks more quickly. The river flowed more freely beneath thinning sheets of ice. People lingered outside a little longer before hurrying back indoors. The city seemed to be waking up. Inside Brooks Technologies, the transformation was even more noticeable. Quarterly performance reports exceeded expectations. Investor confidence strengthened. Several financial publications praised the company's renewed stability. Analysts who once questioned its future now highlighted its disciplined leadership and long-term strategy. Claire Morgan paid little attention to the headlines. She had learned years ago that praise could become just as distracting as criticism. Results mattered. Headlines changed. One Friday morning, she arrived at headquarters carrying a simple leather notebook and a cup of black coffee. Employees greeted her warmly as she crossed the lobby. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had in months. Conversations sounded optimistic. People smiled more often. Confidence was returning, not because someone promised success, but because they could finally see it taking shape. Upstairs, Claire entered a meeting with department managers responsible for employee development and community outreach. The discussion focused on mentorship programs, educational partnerships, and internship opportunities. These projects interested Claire deeply. Numbers mattered. Financial health mattered. But she believed successful companies should improve lives beyond balance sheets. As the meeting progressed, one manager proposed a partnership with local schools and community colleges throughout Connecticut. Claire listened carefully before nodding. Let us move forward with it. The manager smiled. I think it could make a real difference. Claire smiled back. That is exactly why we should do it. Later that afternoon, she received an invitation to speak at a regional business leadership conference scheduled for spring. Several years earlier, she would have declined immediately. Public attention had never appealed to her. Now the situation felt different. The invitation was not about recognition. It was about sharing lessons that might help others. She agreed to attend. Across town, Ethan Brooks stood near the window of his apartment overlooking the river. He held a copy of a business journal featuring an article about Brooks Technologies. Claire's photograph appeared beside the headline discussing strategic leadership and sustainable growth. Ethan studied the page quietly. Months earlier, the image might have triggered resentment. Now it triggered reflection. He found himself oddly grateful. Not for losing control of the company. Nobody enjoys losing something they spent years building. He was grateful for the perspective that followed. Success had always come naturally to him. Recognition arrived early. Praise arrived often. Somewhere along the way, he began believing those things were permanent. Claire's journey had taught him otherwise. One conversation from years earlier returned unexpectedly. He remembered laughing when Claire accepted the evening position at Harbor Bean Cafe. At the time, he viewed it as proof that their lives were moving in opposite directions. Looking back now, he realized something uncomfortable. They had indeed been moving in opposite directions, just not the way he imagined. That evening, Claire stopped by Harbor Bean Cafe after work. Not for a shift, simply for coffee. The familiar smell of roasted beans and warm pastries greeted her immediately. The manager smiled when she entered. Several employees waved. The cafe remained exactly as she remembered. Comfortable, unpretentious, real. She ordered her usual drink and sat near the window watching people move through the city streets outside. Students studied textbooks. Couples shared conversations. Workers ended long days. Nobody paid much attention to the woman sitting quietly with a coffee cup. Claire preferred it that way. As she watched the evening unfold, she thought about the years spent inside this cafe. The long shifts, the early mornings, the ordinary moments that helped shape an extraordinary future. Most people looked at success and focused on the destination. Very few appreciated the value of the road leading there. A young employee approached her table carrying a tray. "Can I ask you something?" Claire smiled. "Of course." The young woman hesitated. "How did you know all the hard work would pay off?" Claire considered the question carefully. Then she laughed softly. "I did not." The employee looked surprised. Claire continued. "I just knew that becoming the kind of person capable of success mattered more than success itself." The answer seemed to linger with the young woman long after she returned to work. Claire watched her disappear behind the counter and smiled. Outside, the winter sky gradually darkened over Hartford. Streetlights reflected across wet sidewalks while the river shimmered beneath the evening glow. For years, people assumed Claire Morgan was working 2 jobs because she was falling behind. The truth was much simpler. She was moving forward, one disciplined day at a time. And now, sitting quietly in the same cafe where so many assumptions had been made, she understood that the greatest investment she ever made was never a company. It was herself. March arrived carrying the first real signs of spring. Snowbanks that had lined Hartford streets for months gradually disappeared beneath warmer sunlight. Trees along the Connecticut River began showing faint hints of green. The city felt lighter somehow, as though it had finally exhaled after a long winter. Claire Morgan noticed the change during her morning drive to headquarters. Sunlight reflected across the river while runners moved along waterfront paths that had been empty only weeks earlier. The season reminded her how quietly transformation often happens. One day, everything appears frozen. Then suddenly life begins moving forward again. Brooks Technologies was experiencing a similar transition. The company had completed its strongest quarter in years. Financial stability continued improving. Employee retention increased. Investor confidence remained strong. Yet the accomplishment Claire valued most had nothing to do with numbers. It was the atmosphere inside the company itself. People seemed energized. Departments collaborated more effectively. Conversations focused less on pressure and more on possibility. The culture was changing. And unlike many business transformations, this one could not be measured by spreadsheets alone. One afternoon, Claire attended a company-wide gathering in the main auditorium. Employees from every department filled the room. Some sat in rows of chairs while others stood near the walls. The event celebrated several internal achievements and recognized employees who contributed exceptional work throughout the quarter. Claire rarely enjoyed being the center of attention, so she kept her remarks brief. She thanked employees for their dedication and emphasized the importance of consistency. Extraordinary outcomes are usually built from ordinary habits repeated over time, she told them. Success rarely arrives all at once. It grows quietly before anyone notices. The statement resonated throughout the room. Many employees understood exactly what she meant. After the event ended, people gathered in small groups discussing future projects and upcoming opportunities. Claire remained behind speaking with several team members. One young analyst approached her nervously. "Can I ask you something?" Claire smiled. "Of course." The analyst hesitated before continuing. "When things were difficult, how did you stay motivated?" Claire thought for a moment. The answer felt simple now, though it had taken years to understand. "I stopped focusing on where I wanted to be," she said. "I focused on becoming the person capable of getting there." The analyst nodded slowly. Claire could almost see the idea taking root. It was a lesson she wished someone had taught her earlier. Across town, Ethan Brooks sat at an outdoor table near a riverside cafe enjoying the first truly warm afternoon of the year. Several months had passed since the acquisition. Life looked different now, simpler in some ways, more honest. Without the constant pressure of controlling every outcome, he found himself paying attention to things he once ignored. Conversations, friendships, time, perspective. He watched people walking along the river and reflected on how dramatically his understanding of success had changed. Losing control of the company had once seemed unimaginable. Yet strangely, the experience had given him something valuable: clarity. He understood now that achievement without balance eventually becomes a burden. Recognition without humility becomes dangerous. The lessons arrived late, but they arrived. That evening, Claire attended a community education event sponsored jointly by Brooks Technologies and several local schools. Students displayed projects. Teachers shared success stories. Families filled the auditorium with excitement and pride. The partnership program, launched only weeks earlier, was already making an impact. As Claire walked through the exhibits, she stopped beside a display created by students interested in entrepreneurship and financial literacy. Their enthusiasm made her smile. One student recognized her immediately. "You are Claire Morgan." She nodded. The student's eyes widened. "You own Brooks Technologies." Claire laughed softly. "Part of it, yes." The student considered that answer carefully. "How did you become successful?" The question felt familiar. It followed her almost everywhere now. Yet her answer remained unchanged. Very slowly. Several students laughed. Claire smiled. "I mean that." She pointed toward their projects. "Most people think success happens in a moment. Usually it happens one decision at a time." The students listened carefully. Their attention reminded her of something imper. By late April, spring had fully arrived in Hartford. Trees along the Connecticut River stood covered in fresh green leaves, and flower boxes brightened the streets surrounding downtown. The city felt alive again. Warm sunlight stretched longer into the evening, casting golden reflections across office buildings and riverfront walkways. Nearly a year had passed since Claire Morgan first sat alone in her apartment reviewing acquisition documents while the rest of the city slept. Looking back now, the distance between that woman and the one standing here felt almost impossible to measure. Not because she had become someone different, because she had finally become fully herself. On a bright Friday afternoon, Brooks Technologies hosted a community celebration at a newly renovated waterfront conference center. Employees, local leaders, educators, students, and business partners gathered beneath clear blue skies overlooking the river. The event marked the completion of several educational initiatives funded through the company's community investment program. Hundreds of students had already benefited from scholarships, internships, and mentorship opportunities. For Claire, those accomplishments mattered more than quarterly earnings reports. Numbers could grow. Numbers could fall. Opportunities could change lives forever. As guests moved between displays and exhibits, conversations filled the open-air venue with warmth and energy. Students proudly demonstrated projects they had created throughout the year. Teachers shared success stories. Families smiled as they watched young people discover possibilities they had never imagined before. Claire walked quietly through the crowd, greeting people and listening more than speaking. She had never been comfortable treating success like a performance. To her, the best achievements spoke for themselves. Near the riverfront promenade, she noticed a familiar figure standing alone beside the railing. Ethan Brooks watched boats moving slowly across the water while afternoon sunlight reflected off the surface in shimmering ribbons of gold. He looked relaxed, more relaxed than she had seen him in years. Claire approached with a small smile. "Enjoying the view?" Ethan turned and laughed softly. "I am trying to remember the last time I stopped long enough to notice one." They stood beside the river for several moments without speaking. The silence felt natural now, comfortable. Time had transformed what once felt impossible into something simple. Mutual respect. Nothing more. Nothing less. Eventually, Ethan nodded toward the crowd. "You built something impressive." Claire followed his gaze. Students laughed together beneath white event tents. Teachers shared stories with business leaders. Families walked along the waterfront. "A lot of people built this," she said. Ethan smiled. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." Claire laughed quietly. The breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and river water through the afternoon air. For a moment, both simply watched the celebration unfold around them. "Do you ever think about that night?" Ethan finally asked. Claire knew immediately what he meant. The cafe, the assumptions, the laughter, the beginning of a story neither of them understood at the time. She thought about the question carefully. "Less than I used to." Ethan nodded. "Me too." The answer surprised neither of them. Some memories lose their weight when enough time passes. Not because they disappear, Because they teach what they came to teach. Across the venue, a group of students gathered near a stage where scholarship recipients were about to be recognized. Organizers began guiding people toward rows of chairs facing the river. Claire glanced at the schedule in her hand. I should probably get up there. Ethan smiled. You should. As she started toward the stage, he called after her. Claire turned. Ethan looked out across the crowd before speaking. For what it is worth, I am glad you never let my opinion define your future. Claire studied him for a moment. Then she smiled. It never did. The honesty of the answer carried no arrogance, only truth. Ethan laughed softly and shook his head. I know. Minutes later, Claire stood before the audience while sunlight reflected across the river behind her. Hundreds of faces looked toward the stage. Students, families, employees, teachers, people standing at the beginning of journeys they could not yet fully see. Claire paused before speaking. The breeze moved gently through the waterfront venue. Spring leaves rustled overhead. Somewhere nearby, a boat horn echoed across the water. Success is often misunderstood, she began. People see the outcome and assume that is the story. The audience listened quietly. But the real story usually happens long before anyone notices. It happens during ordinary days, difficult days, quiet days, the days when nobody is watching. She smiled. Keep showing up anyway. The applause that followed was warm but distant compared to the peace she felt inside. Because the lesson was no longer about business. It was not about ownership. It was not even about success. It was about becoming someone whose future could never be limited by another person's assumptions. As the sun slowly descended over the Connecticut River, painting the water in gold and amber light, Claire looked across the crowd and felt something deeper than accomplishment. She felt gratitude. The second job, the long nights, the sacrifices, the doubts. Every step had mattered. Not because they led her to a company, because they led her to herself. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.